It's strange how empty the highways can feel at night. No matter how wide the road stretches ahead, how many lanes there are, or how brightly the moon shines, the darkness always finds a way to creep into your mind. I learned that the hard way one summer night, driving a long haul through the heart of America. I was heading west on I-70, somewhere in Kansas. The landscape was flat, endless. Fields of corn and wheat rolled out on either side like a sea of shadows. My destination was Denver, a good 500 miles away, and I was on a tight schedule. The company paid well for overnight deliveries, and I needed every penny to keep my family afloat. I had made this drive dozens of times before, but that night felt different. The first oddity came around midnight. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, which wasn't unusual for this stretch of road. But as I approached a rest area, I noticed a sedan parked in the far corner of the lot. Its headlights were off, but the interior light was on, casting a pale glow through the windows. At first, I thought someone might be sleeping inside, but as I passed, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure was sitting in the driver's seat, motionless, staring straight ahead. It wasn't the presence of the person that unsettled me. It was the posture, rigid, unnatural, like a mannequin propped up for display. I told myself to keep driving, but the image lingered in my mind. Something about it didn't sit right. I've seen my share of strange things on the road. Drunk drivers, abandoned cars, even the occasional coyote darting across the asphalt. But this felt wrong. An hour later, I started to feel the fatigue setting in. My eyes grew heavy, and the lines on the road blurred together. I decided it was time for a quick break, so I pulled off at the next rest area. The parking lot was empty, except for a lone pickup truck parked near the entrance. Its windows were fogged up, and I could see the faint outline of a sleeping bag inside. I parked a few spaces away and stepped out into the cool night air. As I stretched my legs and took a sip of water, I noticed something on the ground near the truck. It was a set of tire tracks, but they didn't make sense. They led away from the truck, looping back toward the highway in a zigzag pattern. It looked as if the driver had driven in circles before stopping. The tracks were fresh, too, as if they'd been made only minutes before I arrived. I decided not to dwell on it. People do weird things when they're tired. Maybe the driver was trying to stay awake, or maybe they were just lost. Either way, it wasn't my business. I got back in my car and merged onto the highway, eager to put more miles behind me. That's when I saw the sedan again. It was up ahead, moving slowly in the right lane. Its taillights flickered like they were about to burn out, and the car swerved slightly, as if the driver was struggling to stay in control. I debated whether to pass or keep my distance. Something about that car set me on edge, but I didn't want to get stuck behind it all night. I decided to overtake. As I pulled into the left lane and approached, I glanced over at the driver. It was the same figure I'd seen earlier at the rest area. Same rigid posture, same forward stare. Only now I could see their face. It was pale, almost ghostly, and their eyes were wide open. Too wide, like they'd been pried apart. They didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge my presence as I passed. My heart pounded as I sped up, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that car. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting it to tail me, but it stayed in the right lane, moving at the same sluggish pace. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. By the time I reached a gas station on the outskirts of a small town, I decided I needed a break. The place was old and run down, the kind of station you'd expect to see in a horror movie, but it was well lit and a few other cars were parked outside, so I figured it was safe enough. Inside, the clerk was a middle-aged man with a friendly smile. I grabbed a coffee and a snack, trying to shake the tension in my chest. As I paid, I casually mentioned the sedan to the clerk. "You seen any weird cars around here?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. The clerk's smile faded. "What kind of car?" "A black sedan. Old model. Driver looks off." He frowned, glancing out the window. "You're not the first to mention that. Folks around here say there's a car like that shows up now and then. Always late at night, never stops, just drives around, real slow. Nobody knows where it comes from." "That's comforting," I muttered, trying to mask my discomfort. "You're heading west, right?" he asked. When I nodded, he leaned in and lowered his voice. "Stay on the main road. Don't take any shortcuts, no matter what. People around here, they know better." I thanked him and left, but his words stayed with me. As I got back on the highway, I made a mental note to stick to the interstate, even if it meant adding time to my trip. For the next hour, everything was quiet. The road stretched on, empty and unchanging. I started to think I'd put the weirdness behind me. But then, in the distance, I saw the sedan again. It was parked on the shoulder this time, its hazard lights blinking. As I approached, I slowed down, torn between stopping to help and driving past. But something inside me screamed to keep going, so I did. As I passed, I caught one last glimpse of the driver. They were still sitting there, staring straight ahead, their expression frozen in that same unnatural way. A few miles down the road, I noticed something strange on my dashboard. My GPS, which had been reliable all night, began to glitch. It suggested a route that veered off the highway, a shortcut I knew wasn't there before. My phone's map app displayed the same bizarre detour. I hesitated, recalling the clerk's warning. Yet curiosity gnawed at me, and for reasons I still can't explain, I followed the turn. The road was narrow and unpaved, flanked by towering trees that blocked out the moonlight. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my tires. I felt like I'd driven into another world. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was the driver of the sedan, their rigid posture unmistakable. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. I honked, but they remained rooted to the spot, staring straight ahead. My instincts screamed at me to reverse, but before I could, the figure turned and walked slowly into the woods. Against my better judgment, I rolled down the window and called out, "Hey, are you okay?" No response, just the rustling of leaves as they disappeared into the darkness. I considered leaving, but something compelled me to follow. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out of the car and ventured into the woods, my pulse pounding in my ears. The trail was faint, barely visible under the beam of my flashlight. It twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the forest. Just as I was about to give up and head back, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center was the black sedan, its engine idling and headlights flickering. The driver's seat was empty. My blood ran cold. How had the car gotten here? I scanned the area, but there was no sign of the figure. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the forest itself was watching me. Suddenly, the sedan's horn blared, shattering the silence. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush until I reached my car. I didn't look back as I sped away, my heart pounding with a terror I couldn't explain. I didn't stop again until I reached Denver. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that the sedan was still out there, somewhere on the road, waiting. That night changed the way I see the highways. They're not just roads, they're places where stories linger, where shadows move, where the past and present collide in ways we can't explain. And sometimes they're places where you drive into the unknown, only to find it staring back at you. It's funny how some nights stay etched in your memory, not because they were particularly exciting or pleasant, but because they were downright unsettling. This happened about 3 years ago, during one of my late-night drives. I was working as a long-haul delivery driver back then, making ends meet and saving up for a house. The job paid decently, but it came with its own set of challenges: solitude, endless highways, and the eerie silence of the American roads after midnight. That night, I was driving through a remote stretch in the Midwest. My route was familiar, a winding 2-lane road cutting through flatlands and sparse patches of woods. The sky was moonless, the kind of dark where the headlights of your truck are the only illumination for miles. The radio was on, playing soft rock to keep me company. Outside, the world was an abyss of black. I had about an hour left before I'd reach the motel where I planned to spend the night. My eyelids were heavy, but I'd learned tricks to stay alert, rolling the windows down, chewing gum, or even talking to myself. On this occasion, I decided to pull over for a quick stretch. The next gas station was too far away, and the idea of stopping in the middle of nowhere didn't exactly thrill me, but my body needed it. I eased the truck to the side of the road and stepped out. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of damp earth. I leaned against the hood, staring out at the endless black horizon. That's when I noticed something odd. In the distance, there was a faint glow, almost like a lantern. It swayed gently, flickering like someone was walking with it. At first, I thought it might be a farmhouse, but there were no buildings in sight, just the open fields. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight from the cab and started walking toward it. In the distance, there was a faint glow, almost like a lantern. It swayed gently, flickering like someone was walking with it. At first, I thought it might be a farmhouse, but there were no buildings in sight, just the open fields. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight from the cab and started walking toward it. When I was about 50 yards into the field, I realized how silent it had become. No crickets, no rustling grass, just the sound of my own breathing. The glow was closer now, hovering above the ground. My flashlight beam caught something reflective beneath it, a pair of eyes. It startled me so much, I nearly dropped the flashlight. The figure, or whatever it was, stood motionless. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt glued to the spot. Slowly, the figure turned away, revealing a pale, angular face and thin shoulders draped in what looked like a cloak. The light dimmed, and the figure started walking again, disappearing into the dark. I stumbled backward, tripping over a rock and landing hard on my back. Pain shot up my spine, but adrenaline pushed me back to my feet. I sprinted toward my truck, not daring to look back. When I reached it, I locked the doors and sped off without a second thought. As I drove, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A faint light was bouncing along the road, growing brighter. My grip on the wheel tightened. I pushed the gas pedal, the truck groaning as it picked up speed. But the light kept pace, flickering erratically, as if mocking me. Then, without warning, it vanished. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath. The road ahead was empty, the fields on either side bathed in darkness. For a moment I thought it was over, but when I glanced at the passenger seat, my heart stopped. There, resting on the seat, was a small, tattered piece of cloth. It looked like it had been ripped from the cloak I'd seen on the figure. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? Did it somehow end up in the truck when I wasn't looking? By the time I reached the motel, my nerves were shot. I parked and sat in the cab for a long moment, trying to calm myself. Finally, I grabbed my bag and headed to the front desk. The clerk gave me a key without much conversation, and I was grateful for his indifference. Inside the room, I bolted the door and double-checked the windows. The rational part of my brain tried to explain what I'd seen. Maybe it was a prank, a hiker with a lantern, or even an animal. But none of those explanations felt right. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound made me jump, and I kept the light on until dawn. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. The long hours on the road can make you see things that aren't there, right? That's what I told myself, anyway. For weeks, I avoided that stretch of road, taking longer routes just to steer clear of it. But the image of that figure and its glowing light stayed with me. And every time I'm driving late at night, I can't help but glance at the passenger seat, half expecting to see another piece of that tattered cloth. I never told anyone about it. What would I even say? That I followed a mysterious light into a field and saw something, someone, I couldn't explain? People would think I was crazy. But here's the thing. I've talked to other drivers, guys who've been doing this job for decades, and every now and then, one of them will share a story about strange lights or figures they've seen on lonely roads. They laugh it off, call it highway lore. Maybe that's all it is. But every time I think about that night, I can't shake the feeling that whatever I saw wasn't just a trick of the mind. It was real, and it was watching me.